Hello, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about cameras. I've sort of recently gotten into cameras, so I'm considering myself a beginner when it comes to cameras. But I feel like that gives me a unique perspective on trying to explain the basics of cameras. So in this video, we're going through the parts of a camera, what the physicality of a camera is, and then also the settings that you'll need to know to use your camera to the fullest. Now, before I talk about anything regarding settings, most cameras would have an auto setting, and don't be afraid to use that because it generally knows what it needs, so you can get pretty good results with the auto setting on most cameras. But where it comes to getting very creative or very specific results, that's when you're going to want to be changing around with settings. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is the camera body. This is the main part of the camera and is what you would buy if you were to buy a camera. It holds the sensor, which is arguably the most important part of the camera. It is the part that the light actually hits that captures the image. It is analogous to film back in the day in older cameras. So that is what the lens focuses its light onto, and then it digitally captures that image. Now, some things with sensors is there are three main types of sensors, or three main sizes. The camera that I currently have, which is the Panasonic Lumix G85, it is a micro four thirds sensor, which is the smallest of the three. And it is half the size of what is called a full frame sensor. So a full frame sensor is about 35 millimeters, and a micro four thirds is half that size, meaning that the focal length on any given lens is going to give the same effect as double what it would on a full frame sensor. So this 25 millimeter lens I have on right now would look very similar to a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame sensor. And then we have crop sensors, which would be somewhere in between. Generally, I think they're about 1.5 to 1.6 times crop, whereas this is a 2 times crop, compared to a full frame sensor. The camera body also includes all the processing components that would be required with things like autofocus and of course the implementation of all the settings that you can change. Now, there's plenty of buttons and dials, a lot of which on most cameras you can also adjust, but there's a few important ones which we'll get to later. There's also different modes that you can choose in the manual section. You have your manual where everything is completely manual. You have your aperture priority mode where you choose your aperture and then your shutter speed is determined automatically from that. You have the opposite where you have your S mode, which is shutter priority, which is the exact opposite of aperture. And then P mode is a programmed auto, where you adjust one of them and they adjust together to create the same level of exposure. Now, the main two different types of cameras that we would be talking about are mirrorless or DSLR. DSLR cameras are a bit older and generally much bigger and heavier because they do have a mirror in them. So light would travel through the lens and not hit the sensor yet. The mirror would bounce light up into the viewfinder, which is the part that your eye would look through if you were to hold the camera up to your face. And then when the shutter button is pressed to take an image, the mirror would flip down and allow that light to go onto the sensor itself. So that's why if you have ever taken photos with a DSLR, when you take a photo, the viewfinder would go dark for a second while the shutter is open, allowing light onto the sensor. Now, obviously a mirrorless camera would be a similar sort of thing, but without that mirror. So it just allows the light to be directly sent to the sensor, and then that is captured into what is called an electronic viewfinder. So there's no mirror, you're not seeing a reflection of the image in the viewfinder, you're seeing a digital version of the image. So it's basically a tiny screen in that viewfinder. So the light is always hitting the sensor through the lens, and then that image is being sent digitally to the viewfinder and the LCD screen if you have that selected. Generally, you can switch between whether you want the electronic viewfinder or the LCD. Now, when it comes to lenses, the lens is the piece of glass that goes on the front of the camera. That is what focuses and captures the light to send into the sensor of the camera. This is a lens. There are many different types of lenses. This one right here is a 12 to 60 f 3.5 to 5.6. Now, what do those mean? The 12 to 60 millimeter is the focal length, right? So the focal length is basically the zoom of a lens. This can go from 12 millimeters all the way to 60. Okay, the higher the number, the more zoomed it is. Now, this is different to, say, the zoom on an older, cheaper digital camera or maybe a phone camera, as they'll be digital zoom, which means you'll zoom in on the image itself and lose resolution. Whereas with this, You zoom in, you maintain the entire resolution of the sensor, so you're not zooming into something that is really far away and then it being very pixelated or grainy. Now, if a lens was to not have this zoom function, if the focal length was simply a single number, like the lens we have on now, which is a 25mm lens, that is called a prime lens. Now, prime meaning it does not change, it is a singular focal length. The benefits to prime lenses are, one, they're cheaper, and two, they can get to lower apertures. Now, the aperture is how big the hole of the lens opens. Okay, how much light is being let into the sensor. Now, this lens that I have on the camera right now is a 1.4, and as I said before, this is a 3.5 to 5.6. Now, 1.4 is actually a bigger aperture than 3.5. So with aperture, the lower the number, the bigger the aperture, meaning the more light that it allows in, and probably one of the most important parts is the shallower the depth of field. So with a lens like this, we could have a very shallow depth of field, which means that if I'm in focus, my background and my foreground are much blurrier than they would be with a higher aperture. Now, these photos here are taken on the same camera with the same lens, just one is set at 1.4 aperture and one is set at f8. And you could probably see the difference in the depth of field between these two pictures. Now, back to this zoom lens, its aperture was a 3.5 to 5.6. That means that as you zoom in, the aperture has to close, okay? So when we're talking about aperture, that f-stop, so when it's the f and then a number, that's the widest an aperture can go, or the lowest the number goes. With this, at 3.5 right now, it's at 12mm. And if we zoom all the way into 60mm, now the minimum it can go is 5.6. So that is one of the benefits of prime lenses over zoom lenses. And the other benefit of allowing more light in, like a lower aperture would, is better performance in low light. So you do not need as much light to be able to see as much. I generally find when I'm using my current light that I'm using right now, I can have it on its lowest setting with this lens, but if I use this lens, I need to turn it almost all the way up just to have the same lighting performance. Obviously, lenses will have a focus. So we talked about depth of field and what is in focus and what is not. Lenses will have a focus ring. So on here we can focus manually using this ring on the lens, which is next to the zoom ring. Now, the prime lens will not have a zoom ring, it'll only have a focus ring. This is for manual focus, which means you can just turn it and move that focus further or closer to the lens itself. Most cameras and lenses would have autofocus functions. So currently this camera is set to lock onto my face to focus. So if I move closer, it should keep tracking and focus, and then it should focus back when I move back. So generally most people wouldn't really use much manual focus, since autofocus is generally pretty good. I use manual focus on my stream on this lens just because I'm not recording while I'm streaming with the camera, and for some reason with this camera the autofocus doesn't work particularly well unless you're recording. This is my other lens set at 12mm focal length. As you can see, it's a much wider image. You can see way more of the background, you can see the mic. Now, the reasons that you might want a wider image like this, maybe if you were vlogging, so I currently use this lens when I do vlog, or if you wanted to capture wider images of, say, a landscape or something like that. Given that this is an f3.5 aperture, there isn't a whole lot of depth of field, it's very deep, so the background is in focus, I'm in focus. As I go out of focus, nice. And then, seeing as this is a zoom lens, I can zoom it all the way into 60mm, which is way, way closer. So this would be better if you were, trying to get a bit more distance or trying to get closer into something that you are a bit further away from. Focal length like this also does affect depth of field. For example, if I reach out here, you can see my hand is slightly out of focus, as it is focused on my face right now. But when I zoom out to 12mm, my hand isn't that out of focus, and when it's the same distance away. So this is because at higher focal lengths, there's more compression on the image and a shallower depth of field. So not only does a lower aperture decrease depth of field, so too does increasing focal length. So at higher focal lengths and lower apertures, you're going to have a blurrier background, a blurrier foreground. So this is now set to 25mm of focal length, which is the same as this lens. This is my 25mm 1.7, and as you can see, this is significantly darker than the image from this lens, because this is a 1.7 and this is about a 4. This is about an f4 at the moment, being slightly zoomed in, 3.5 at 12 millimeters, remember? And so then if we zoom in to 25, we're going to slightly increase that aperture number. And not only is it darker, it also has a deeper depth of field. So my hand is only slightly out of focus here, whereas with this lens, it would be significantly out of focus. Now, when it comes to the settings of cameras, particularly when you're shooting, the big ones that we're going to talk about are ISO, shutter speed, and we've already talked about aperture. So ISO is the sensitivity to light of the sensor. So you can turn that up or down depending on the conditions. If it is very bright, say you're outside in the full sun, you'd want to turn your ISO down as far as possible. If you came inside to a room, where my room right now is not particularly bright, so my ISO is not turned down very far, it's actually a fair way up. Now, the downside to having a high ISO is generally the higher your ISO, the noisier your image will be. So you'll start seeing noise in the background and just grainy sort of footage or photos. And this would obviously depend on the camera itself. If a better quality camera would be able to go higher in ISO than a lower quality camera and still maintain good image quality. So to show you the difference between different levels of ISO and white balance, I'm gonna change the settings on the camera right now while you're watching. So right now we're at 6400 ISO, and my room is not very bright. I do have a light on me, but otherwise I'm not very bright. And if I turn the ISO down all the way to 200, you can't see anything. So that's the effect ISO has. It's the sensitivity to light of the sensor, or I've heard other people call it fake light, where it's just adding fake light. But I don't know if you can tell sort of in this image, but it is slightly noisier the higher you go. And we also have white balance, which basically is how warm or cold the light is. So this is measured in Kelvin, and as we go up, we get to this really orange. So this is 10,000 Kelvin. You can see it's very orange. And then as we go down in Kelvin, you can see it's starting to cool down, get a little bit more blue, and then it looks normal, and then it's getting too blue. And we get all the way down to 2500 Kelvin, where it just looks ridiculous and it's very blue. But that's basically what white balance is. Generally around the 5 to 7,000, I think, is pretty standard. This is 5600, which is a pretty standard level, but it would depend on your lighting situation whether you would go up or down in Kelvin. Auto white balance tends to work pretty well anyway. I think I usually leave it on auto white balance. And we also have shutter speed. Now, shutter speed, as you could imagine, is how fast the shutter opens and closes. This is generally talked about in times per second, or how many seconds per open and close. Now, currently I'm on a shutter speed of 1/50, which is 1/50th of a second. So that means 50 times per second the shutter is opening and closing. And this is because it is a general rule that you want to be shooting at twice the shutter speed of your frame rate. So I'm currently shooting at 24 frames per second, so I'm at a shutter speed of 1/50. Things with shutter speed is the higher you go, the darker it's going to be. The lower you go, the brighter it's going to be, because it is allowing more or less light in, the slower or faster the shutter is opening and closing. Now, if you've seen those night photos that have those beams of light that go across from a car driving through a frame, or stars moving through the night sky, because the shutter was left open for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 3 minutes, that is because the shutter is literally just left open and is getting all that light in that entire time, and then combining it all into one image. Whereas if you were maybe trying to take photos or videos of sports, maybe you'd want to be shooting at a much higher shutter speed, because you don't want any of that motion blur. You want to be able to capture things right when they happen with no blur. So that the faster something is moving, the faster your shutter speed would need to be. This is generally for photography, but for videography, they generally recommend twice your shutter speed. That being said, adjusting your aperture and shutter speed can influence the brightness or darkness of your image, along with your ISO. But because they also affect other things, you kind of don't really want to change them if you don't have to. That is why things like ND filters come into play, which I'll mention very shortly. Now, when it comes to resolution, generally resolution is talked about in megapixels, or in horizontal by vertical pixels. So particularly when we're talking about video, we would talk about 1080p or 4K, 1080p being 1920 by 1080 and 4K being 3840 by 2160. So those are just the amount of pixels across and down that the image has. So obviously the more pixels an image has, the higher the quality, the crisper it'll look. Now, regarding megapixels, a megapixel is simply 1 million pixels. So my 16 megapixel camera will take photos with approximately 16 million pixels. And the general rule with megapixel sensors is the higher the megapixel sensor, the better quality photos you will have, but not necessarily the better quality videos. So generally video-centric cameras will have a lower megapixel count because they can have bigger pixels, which allow more information for the video. And also having too high resolution sensor can cause issues with overheating and stuff like that in video-centric cameras. Still on video, we're going to talk about frames per second. Generally, these would be 24, 30, 60, 120, or 240. And this is how many images per second are captured in that video. So in its most simple terms, a video is a lot of pictures back to back to back, many times a second. Now, cinema is generally filmed in 24 frames per second. Most monitors tend to run at 60 Hertz, which is 60 frames per second, although they can go up to 240. Generally, the higher the frame rate you would go would be if you want to slow that footage down. So if you want to have very high quality slow motion footage, then you would use a 120 or 240 frame per second setting on your camera. So then you can play it back at maybe 30 frames per second. Because it is captured so many more frames per second, if you slow it down by 4 times, 8 times, it's going to be a much more cinematic slow motion image. Now, when it comes to the file types that a camera would capture, generally for photos we have JPEG, which most people would be familiar with, and we have RAW files. Now, JPEGs are much smaller, they don't have as much information in them, but they're much easier to work with. So if you just want to take a quick picture and just post it to social media, JPEG would be the easiest. But if you want to take very high quality photos and edit them in something like Lightroom, Photoshop, or Affinity Photo, then you're going to want to capture raw images, which have a lot more data in them. They're much larger files, but you can do so much more with them when it comes to editing. So if you want to do any post-production on your photos, it is the best idea to shoot raw. With video, it's a similar sort of thing where you can shoot in MP4 or other video formats. You can shoot raw, but generally they're going to be a much higher end cameras. So my camera cannot shoot raw video, so that's not really an option for me. I just shoot in MP4, but it's the same sort of thing as photos. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about accessories for cameras. Going all the way back to the features of the body, on the top of most mirrorless or DSLR cameras is a hot shoe or cold shoe. This is just a location for an accessory like a microphone or an external flash to be attached. And the difference between hot and cold is just whether or not there are electrical contacts. So whether or not you can power something and send a signal through from the device that's attached to the camera or vice versa. If it is hot, it does have that electric capability. If not, then it is cold shoe. Currently, I have a microphone on the accessory shoe on my camera. And this leads me to my next point. With microphones, you can plug them in to most cameras. Most cameras would have a 3.5mm jack, or most people would know them as a headphone jack on a phone or a computer. The same sort of thing. So any 3.5mm on-camera microphone would slot onto the accessory shoe and then plug into the 3.5mm jack on the side of the camera. Now, the higher end cameras you go, maybe you could have an audio handle which would go on the top, which would give you XLR inputs, which allow a wider variety of microphones and a better quality connection to the camera. Or even very high-end cinema cameras would have built-in XLR inputs. On the bottom of most cameras, there would also be a 1/4-20 threaded hole for tripod mounting. Now, as you can see, this camera is sitting still, so it is on a tripod. It is just being screwed on to the mounting plate of the tripod, and then that plate slides into the top of the tripod. There are many different types of tripods. You can have tripods that stand multiple meters tall, very heavy-duty ones, or you could have smaller portable tripods like this GorillaPod here, or even very small ones that have this action camera on it. Now, when it comes to lens accessories, one of the big ones which is considered very important is an ND filter, which is a small piece of glass that goes on the end of a lens, which basically acts like sunglasses for the lens. You can get variable ND filters which can adjust their tint essentially, but just by turning them. So you can have like a 2 to 5 stop or a 6 to 9 stop, which just means how dark or light they can go. You can also get polarizing lenses, which again would do the same thing as any sort of polarizing sunglass. They would just reduce glare in the image. And the last accessory we're going to talk about is a lens hood. Now, this just came with this lens. It clips on, twisted on, and it basically limits the amount of random light that could be coming from the side to cause lens flares or glare or other issues like that. So if you do not have a filter on, like I don't, then it's probably a good idea to pretty much always have a lens hood on to limit the effects of stray light that could be affecting your image. And that about sums up cameras from a beginner's perspective. So thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please click like, comment any questions that you may have or anything that you think I got wrong. I'm still new to this. Please subscribe if you would like more of these, because I do plan on doing more of these types of videos. I also stream 3 times a week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, and I post videos every Thursday. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, come on, focus. Bruh. Is the focus just that bad on 4K or what? Wait. Don't forget to click the like button and the subscribe button. And go watch another video. Or all the other videos. They're over there.